Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, a podcast with myself and Matt Kelly, founder and editor at Radical Compliance. This is the compliance podcast that geeks out and takes a deep dive into a compliance or compliance-related issue each week. And today, we really do go into the weeds to take a look at the COSO ERM Framework, which was released last week. Matt and I consider the structural framework of the COSO ERM Framework with 5 major components, each supported by multiple principles. There are 20 total principles. We consider some of the changes in nomenclature in the principles, which I found to be significant. We review the COSO image, the COSO ERM Framework image, which is a double-helix intended to convey the idea that risk management principles should be woven into all parts of the enterprise. We conclude with some of the challenges presented by the ERM framework for implementation, particularly by the compliance practitioner or risk management practitioner within an organization. It's a good look at our original look by Matt and I at the COSO ERM framework. We will no doubt spend future podcasts taking a deep dive into this, as we both find it to be highly significant and incredibly important. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again for another episode of Compliance Into the Weeds with my good friend and colleague, Matt Kelly, founder and editor of Radical Compliance. This week, we are going to take a deep dive into the debut of the final COSO ERM framework. So, Matt, welcome. Thanks for blogging about this. And why don't we just jump right into this? There were a couple of changes that I actually thought made sense from a naming perspective. And you detailed those, that 2 components have new names. Risk and execution is now performance, and monitoring risk management performance is revision and review. And I really think that's actually a fairly significant change, because it speaks more to putting ERM, really burning it into the DNA of the organization. We'll get into the DNA, double helix, and a few of those other concepts later. But I really like the idea where they moved away from more technical words to really even plainer Janer words. But I thought the plainer Janer words actually spoke more broadly to what they're trying to do here. Any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I agree. I like the ERM framework. I like the idea of having an ERM framework, and COSO is a very good one to do it. That said, I know that there are going to be cynical people out there who think COSO is a collection of GRC proponents, a lot of vendors involved, or consulting services, and people are going to look at this and wonder, is this just a document to talk me into another big COSO implementation project? Because we all did this first in the 2000s with SOX internal controls, and then more recently with the updated version of the COSO internal control framework. Now, those were good projects too, but they did cost a lot of money. And I am certain that there will be some people who will see this new ERM framework and are going to think this is another bunch of good buzzwords from a lot of consultants who will miraculously tell me that the key to my success at risk management is I give them more consulting fees. Now, whether or not that is true, I'll put it aside, but I will say the idea of this framework, having one for risk management, that's good. And I'm always a fan of putting it into plain terms. So something as simple as moving away from execution risk to performance. Good. Everybody gets what performance is. It's about clarity here. And same with monitoring risk management performance. That was an old name. Now it's going to be called review and revision. We're going to need to win over a lot of strategy and business unit operating people to get this ERM project done, whatever it may be at your business. You're going to need to get a lot of non-technical people involved. So non-technical language is good. I'm for it.
So actually, I thought you said several different and important things in that. So let me unpack a few of those. But let me start with simply the word performance and why I found that change to be so powerful. I thought it spoke to not only using a less technical or if more simpatico word would be one way to look at it. But I thought it really spoke more towards what they're trying to get at, or COSO is trying to get at, which is moving enterprise risk management throughout the organization and making or helping people to understand that performance is tied directly to risk management, and even flipping it the other way, risk management is performance. So that really struck me as a significant change, Matt, and it really, I thought it didn't crystallize my thinking because the thinking was already there. But what I want to try to do is take these concepts that COSO has put forward for us, and it really, revelatory regime change came with the internal controls framework, but I see this as really a next step. And if we can get people to start thinking about risk management, risk monitoring, and assessing of risk really at all levels, I think it will make for better performance and at the end of the day, a more efficient and profitable organization.
I think that's true. And I think that looks at it as the ERM framework applied to operations in your business unit. And all of that is going to happen some way, somehow, sometime as companies move forward trying to manage risk a little bit more in a disciplined way. But aside from that, there is another level to this that I'm sure COSO thought about, and it's mentioned in the executive summary of the framework, which I did read. I have not read the entire framework document, but the other part of what they would like us to do here is take risk management and apply it to strategy. And that's all stuff that the boardroom talks about, the CEO, the CFO, they all love to talk about strategy. And I think what has happened many times, I've certainly seen this in my career, is the big wigs will come up with strategy and say, hey, this is great. What can go wrong? Just make sure it doesn't go wrong. And then we mere mortals have to go out and try and apply risk management to it, which does or does not work. And suddenly the strategy isn't delivering like we expected, and it becomes a mess. I've seen that. I bet you've seen it, and other people listening, you've seen this before. What COSO would like to do applying this framework to strategy is more have these conversations in the boardrooms with the bigwigs as they're thinking through strategies. So rather than come up with one that doesn't work like they thought and they chuck it over the side and we pick a new one, we come up with what probably will work, risk adjust it, so that when you try to put it into operation, the strategy might actually do what people said it was going to do. Who knew that these kind of things could happen? But I think it's more about coming up with a more thoughtful, disciplined strategy at the beginning that can withstand more of the buffeting that goes on out in the business world and all of these unexpected risks and surprises. If you apply a risk-adjusted strategy, and I know we're getting nerdy here, but if you apply that,
that's what
strategy may not. That's true. We are deep in the weeds here, but if you have a risk-adjusted strategy, it may not be as glorious as a risk unadjusted strategy, but it's more likely to work. And I found at the end of the day, people like things that work rather than things that sound great and then don't work 4 quarters later and the CEO gets replaced. So that I think is a big part of this. And frankly, that's going to be a big part of getting boards and CEOs to warm up to this whole idea that there's an ERM framework out there. What are we going to do with this? Compliance officers, risk officers, you could apply this locally, I guess we'll say, in the business units. But if you really want to apply it to strategy and to the C-suite, you're going to need to get them thinking about it in their terms at their level. That's going to be one way to do it. And like I said, we've nerded out about this a bit here, but read the executive summary and you can get a better sense of what COSO means when they talk about applying risk management to strategy. And it's not a bad idea. There's a lot of bad strategy out there.
So I'm not finished nerding out, so don't think you're going to get off that easy.
Let's do it, man. Yeah. Let's go for it.
Because what I see is I want to start with profitability. And the things that I see in the movie Margin Call, Jeremy Irons said there are 3 ways to make money: be the first, be the best, or cheat. And he didn't want to cheat, although that movie was largely about the fall of Lehman Brothers. Nevertheless, if you want to be first, typically that means you're going to have to take risks. And the more nuanced your risk management strategy is, the more robust your ERM framework is, the more risks you can take because you have mapped those risks out and you have planned for them. And then you have read Matt Kelly and used the OODA feedback loop to take the information from your risk-based monitoring and looped it back in to your business strategy or strategic risk strategy going forward. So I see this as a way to allow companies to move faster. Or to go back to former Citibank chairman John Reed, who said the reason you have brakes is not to slow down. The reason you have brakes on a car is to go fast. And I see this ERM framework as exactly that, giving businesses components to have, frankly, a much more robust risk management framework, which would allow them to react to market conditions, whether it be geographic, whether they be product, whether they be government regulations or other, more quickly because they have better risk management in place.
I think that's all true. But now trying to bring it back to a bit more of a practical level, I think, anybody who thinks that the ERM framework is a good idea or a framework for ERM, not necessarily even this one, because there are some others out there, but if you want this to happen at your company, okay, how are you going to sell it? Because only two people are going to sell it, either the outsiders who are the consulting firms, the GRC vendors and whatnot, and a lot of them are very smart people. But if they're trying to sell it to your board, the board is going to look at them a bit squinty and wonder, do we reach for the wallet now and put a lock on it because they're going to hit us up for money? Is this a scam? There's going to be that. Or it can be somebody inside the company who's going to be able to say, we can really deliver more value by doing this. Who's that person inside the company? Very likely the sort of person who's listening to this podcast right now. It's going to be you compliance and risk officers out there and the internal audit people who also think about this. So one question I have, which I don't know yet because I haven't really fully contemplated the ERM framework and its implications yet, but if you've already been using the COSO internal control framework, how would you then take this ERM framework and draw connections from what you've already done on internal control and compliance to better risk management? Where are the connections between these two frameworks? And COSO was aware of that. COSO said they tried to make the connections very clear. I've heard from a lot of people who said that's great because they weren't really clear the first time with the first draft last summer. And they'd love to see more clarity and how they can take the work they've already done around internal controls and scale it up for better sorts of risk management. I think that's a great idea. I do not think it's something you're going to do in a quarter or in a year. This is like going to the gym to stay in good shape. You are never done. But how would you actually get started on this? How are you going to sell it? How are you going to make it work? That's something compliance and internal control officers are going to need to think about if this is something that you want to go down this road. I mean, we should point out that, look, everybody already manages risks at their company in some way or some form. You're probably doing it, making it up as you go along. It's probably not a very disciplined approach. You might not even know that you are managing risks in a certain way. We all do it. This is a way to make it a bit more disciplined and systematic, which is good. Question is going to be, how do you implement something? And whether it's this framework or something else, how do you convince people that implementing is a good idea? I don't know. We'll have plenty to talk about on that.
So I think that really a chief compliance officer or chief risk officer could start with this and use this and exactly what you said, using the 2013 internal controls framework as a starting point. Just use the ERM framework and perform a gap analysis. And the places where ERM says go in a deeper or different direction from your internal controls framework, I think that's a way to, that would be the way I would advocate it within an organization to be approached, and then figure out what you might need to put in place or risks that you're not accurately forecasting, assessing, monitoring, and then managing back after you accept that risk. So I see a variety of ways to use this since we have the 2013 internal controls framework, we're not really starting from near ground zero. And I just see this as a great resource for the compliance and risk practitioner going forward.
I think so. And I think that, if people want to ask, they're thinking to themselves right now, like, what do I do next? How do I get started? You could definitely tackle some tangible risks first. EHS risk is always something that it's well known, it's well understood. There's a lot of other software out there to help you manage EHS risks. How can you build feedback loops there, and how can you develop a better sense of your risk tolerances around EHS? You could certainly try this with some financial risks, currency exposures and whatnot. That's a very mature field, and people in the financial services industry are probably well ahead on those kind of things anyways. Now, where I start to get a little bit fuzzy is on something like, cybersecurity risk is going to become very difficult, I think, to forecast. A very small slip up can lead to some enormous damage. And so what are the policies? What are the controls? What are the no-go zones you're never going to relieve on cybersecurity? Where are you going to accept some risk? It's hard to say. I think that we've got a lot of growing to do there, and probably in some other fields. But I wholly agree that, the mechanics of it, if you sketch it out on a piece of paper, what am I supposed to do? Do the side-by-side, do the gap analysis, figure out what's my pilot program, what does success look like. You can go from there. If you want to spend a lot of money with a lot of consultants, they'll be happy to take your money and talk to it about you. But you could probably even just do this on your own in a small scale. And like I mentioned before, this is like going to the gym. It's good for you, but there's no beginning or there's no end to it. Once you start, you have to keep on going and going and going until the end.
As you might guess, I'm still thinking about the weather here in Houston. And I'm thinking about the weather-related risks that companies have. And I've been thinking about the opportunities that have been presented to companies because of the weather-related risks. So I see something like this, and I would want to go to an organization and say, have you assessed your risks for a 500 or 1,000 year weather-related event? But more importantly, have you assessed the opportunities that might be available to you, because you could respond to those risks, or you could manage those risks in a way that you could respond more quickly? So I may want to, go into the weeds a whole lot on this, simply because I've been thinking a lot about different kinds of risk, or at least risks, how they may impact companies in different ways than I thought just simply having a storm blow your building away.
See, and I agree with all that. But I think that this is where some people might get overwhelmed and intimidated. I think storm risk is very real. But so are you going to design a more distributed and decentralized supply organization with different offices? Are you going to invest in technology to let people work at home? Are you going to get insurance up to your eyeballs? Are you going to do all three? It's quickly can get very daunting at first. And so I think that people will need to take a deep breath and pull themselves up by their socks and make sure that they're ready to do this. But it can be done, and there's no rush. You're not going to fail if you don't implement this by December. It's there for the long term.
So you have a line from Robert Hirth in your blog post that I thought really sums up not only the goal of the COSO ERM framework, but really where I would like to see this discussion go. And you quote Hirth to say, our overall goal is to continue to encourage a risk-conscious culture. And that risk consciousness is something that, once again, it's on my mind a lot being in Houston, but it's really where I think and hope corporations at the highest level would start to be aware of and move towards, is having that risk-conscious approach and risk-conscious culture, most particularly at the board. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I suspected that as soon as you said Bob Hirth, you're going to throw that line out, because it's spot on with the challenge of the future. And I think a great example is cybersecurity risk, because for all that you invest in anti-penetration tools so hackers can't get in, who cares? Because these days, your biggest risk is that the employee inadvertently gives up the good data by mistake, and they need to be risk aware. And I think that that is a very practical, tangible example of what we're talking about. I think at the board level, they would certainly agree that a lot of the risks that are really going to cause the company damage can't necessarily be controlled so much as they can be observed and then responded to. And I would even say in the board level, there's maybe a not as much risk awareness around some strategy ideas as we would like. And, a company will say that we want a highly acquisitive strategy. Well, there's a lot more to it than that. And how well do these boards understand what that means? Not entirely sure. There's all sorts of ways you can parse this out, but show me the world where we're going to build flawless internal controls and people can go on autopilot and not worry about risk because somebody else has already taken care of it and it's baked into the system. That's what a risk unconscious world would be, and that's not real. That's never going to be real. It's not going to happen. Bob is entirely spot on when he says this is what people need to do, is dial up the risk consciousness.
Well, Matt, this has been a ton of fun and something that I hope we can explore as we go down the road. You are attending what's the name of the Workiva conference you're attending next week?
The Tech Conference. I think it's called the Exchange Community, but Tech 2017 happening in Las Vegas next week.
Will you be speaking at that event?
I will be. I will be shooting the breeze with several thinkers about internal controls around the future of Sarbanes-Oxley compliance and a few financial reporting issues, and I look forward to it.
In the past, you've done some, if not live blogging, certainly a day or two after. Will we see something along those lines this year?
That is part of it, yes. Workiva is very generously agreeing to have me out there so I can be a man on the scene and report on some of what I hear and see out there and help facilitate some discussions with their other thought leaders and thought gurus and talk with a lot of their audience, who are a great audience. This is a fantastic conference. If you are diehard internal control, SOX compliance, Tech puts on a really good show. Clearly, it is to preach the gospel of how cool Workiva products are, but even that aside, the substance of what they're talking about, the issues, a lot of really good discussion that goes on there, regardless of whatever kind of software tools are hovering around the edges. So it's going to be a good show.
Well, perhaps next week we can go into the weeds on your experience from the Workiva Tech Conference.
I will call in from Vegas, absolutely.
This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds. In my show notes, I link to Matt's blog post about the COSO ERM Framework. I also link to the executive summary, and if you'd like to purchase a full copy of it, I've linked to that as well. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only podcast which takes a deep dive into the weeds of a compliance or compliance-related issue each week. Finally, if you have any questions, please contact me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com or contact Matt Kelly at mkelly@radicalcompliance.com. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Compliance Into the Weeds, and I hope you will join me next week for another episode. Hopefully we can catch up with Matt at the Workiva Tech Conference. Compliance Into the Weeds is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.